Hello.
Hey everyone, we're back.
Yeah, welcome to the first season, the first episode of our next season where we change things up a bit and we have our first guest, Sarah, on today.
Sarah, thanks for being here and being our first guinea pig.
Guinea pig? Yeah, sure.
For the style of the new season. Before we dive into the new style here in the flow, do you want to just introduce yourself and your family, set the stage a little bit?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me, you guys. My family and I, so my husband and I have two kids. Our oldest is 3.5, and then our youngest is 1.5, and we are on the North Shore now. We were in Boston before, which is how, my OB connected me with you guys back when I had my oldest. But now we are outside of the city, living in the suburbs.
Living the full suburban life.
Yes, which I really miss the city, but it's nice.
Talking to two people who are staying in the city as long as possible.
Really hanging on for dear life over here in my very tiny condo.
Yeah. So as you will see, Sarah, and our listeners will hear as the season goes on, what we really wanted to highlight during this season is real people, real parents coming on and sharing a bit about their parenting journey, in particular, like what postpartum looked like for them, and really just trying to highlight the differences and people's experiences.
Sure.
With the goal of accomplishing two things, right? One of them being like allowing people to hear that they're not alone if they have gone through something similar, and also for you to sort of showcase like what that experience was like for you in your own words, and what helped you through that, right? So that other people who may be going through this as well have those resources either in people like you or resources that you found helpful at the time. So we're really excited to just actually like turn it over to you, Sarah, and to give you the floor to sort of share whatever it is that you want to share about your experiences with one or both of your kids.
And I'm curious too, because your kids are they're a bit older now too.
Yeah.
So
yes,
I'm curious to know what piece of this you're going to share as you look back.
Yeah. So I think when I think about my postpartum experience with my daughter, my younger one, Ella, I found postpartum with my oldest really challenging. I think like the lack of sleep, figuring out breastfeeding took a really long time. It felt just like very emotional. That was still during like COVID. So there were no like mommy and me groups. So I found that really isolating. And it was also, we were in this weird time of like, can we have family come and help? Like, is that safe? Like people were going back to work, but like, we still just didn't know a lot of
wiping groceries down. So
right.
having family over was definitely questionable.
Yeah. So I found that really hard with him. And so I was excited to have like a more normal postpartum experience with my second. And that definitely didn't happen either, but for very different reasons. With my daughter, my water broke at 29 weeks. So I was admitted to antepartum at BI, which again, like nothing I ever imagined in a million years.
Yeah.
And the plan was that either I would go into labor on my own or they would induce me at 34 weeks. And so
Can I ask you one quick question,
Yeah.
Sarah? So you didn't have any premature labor with your son, correct?
Right.
And were there any signs during your pregnancy that you may like have, premature, rupture of membranes, we call it, right? Like breaking your water early or going into labor early with your second pregnancy?
So the only thing that was abnormal about my pregnancy with my daughter is that I had a lot of unexplained bleeding.
Okay.
Up until about 20 weeks. At first they had said, maybe there was like a hematoma or something. And then they just kind of chalked it up to being like, you have a really sensitive cervix.
Yep.
Baby looks great. But then that actually stopped.
Okay.
After my anatomy scan, I like didn't have any more bleeding. I'm like, this is great. Like we're in the clear.
Right.
But that was kind of it.
Okay.
And
so this just
goodness,
like came out of the blue.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
When your water broke.
Oh my God. So I was at home and at first it was like a small like a tiny gush maybe. And at first I was like, oh my God, I must be bleeding again.
Gotcha.
So I ran to the bathroom and it wasn't that. And I was like, that's a little weird. But then like throughout that night, I had said to my husband, I'm like, there's no way my water could have broken, right? And he was like, no, like that's crazy. So I was like, okay, we'll just see what happens. And then it was at like 5 a.m. the next morning, I stood up and had like the classic, like huge gush. Thank goodness, like didn't go into labor.
Right.
Yeah. So that happened. I was admitted, thankfully didn't go into labor right away.
Yeah.
So they kept me on antepartum and I was there for almost 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Before I went into labor on my own.
Okay.
And so I feel like I spent a lot of that time. I was like devastated to be away from my older one.
Yeah.
And just, I think too, like the distance of, I would see him, I think like twice a week. Like my mom would bring him once or I'd see him 3 times a week. My husband would bring him on the weekends. So that was really tricky. So I was really focused during my like time there of like, okay, how am I going to handle once we have this baby? We know she's going to be in the NICU. And so like, how are we going to handle that? Because I knew like I would feel so torn between like, how do you split your time? And so it was definitely nice to like have a heads up of like, all right, she's going to be in the NICU. Like we knew that.
You're looking for some kind of control at this point.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I remember just like Googling, like trying to find other people who had had this experience, like hoping that someone had written a blog post about, being on antepartum, having other kids at home, having a NICU stay. And I like really couldn't find anything. And so I just was kind of like, okay, we're going to have a plan. Like I will be at home when Charlie, my older one, wakes up. Then I'll go to the NICU and I will be home to pick him up from school. He goes to like a little Montessori
Charlie's
school.
How old at the time of birth? Like a year and a half?
He had just turned 2.
He had just turned 2. Okay.
Yep.
So hard.
Ugh,
hard. And I just want to point out, which I'm sure you'll elaborate on, that the days must feel very long on an antepartum floor. And you're just like alone with your thoughts all day. Like I'm not surprised to hear that you were Googling anything, like a blog or another mom, like a person to find.
Right. I found, that was really hard. I think antepartum was, the nurses are like angels. I love them so much, but that was just not an experience I would like ever wish for someone.
Yeah.
But again, just like looking for other people who had experienced that.
Yeah.
Something that I wished I'd found. And I just remember too, even like, there were other women obviously on the floor and just seeing like every time someone had their baby and they would go home and I was like, I just want to have this baby. And looking back on it now, I'm so thankful that she stayed in for as long as she did, because 29 weeks versus 33 is like wildly different.
Totally.
Right.
So I'm so happy she stayed in. So like looking back on it, I'm like, I wish I had known that a little bit more, knowing that we still had a decent NICU stay ahead of us.
Yeah.
But that it really was so important for her to just keep growing.
I mean, I think the other piece too, Sarah, and tell me if this is like something that you thought about or felt, or maybe this is something you've reflected on now after going through it, is like, and I know this is like sort of like a hot phrase right now, but like 2 things can be true, right? Like you can want to have this baby and go home and feel like you have some element of control and understand the importance of her needing to like stay inside as long as possible and knowing that that's better like for her outcomes, right? Like you can, I feel like there's this element of like, you can want both of those things. And I think like understanding that those 2 feelings can exist at the same time is also really important too, so that it's not an element of, and I don't know if you ever felt like this or if anybody listening to this in a similar situation feels this way, but like you're not beating yourself up or making yourself feel bad or feeling guilty about having that thought of like, I just want to have this baby and go the fuck home.
Right.
It's hard though because you have another kid, so the guilt is playing off each other.
Totally.
Like, I need to get home because I want to be there for my toddler child, right?
Yeah.
But then there's this guilt, like, well, I shouldn't feel that way because I need to keep this baby in.
Right.
You're being torn between your 2 kids.
Both of your kids, right? Which I think is an idea, like is a concept that anybody with more than one kid could resonate with,
Right.
Like
Definitely.
under normal circumstances where you don't have a NICU admission or an antepartum admission and a kid at home, you have 2 kids. There is not one mom that I have met who had their second baby and doesn't have this guilt around splitting their time between their 2 kids.
And your love.
Totally.
Everyone has
Yes.
that, like, how
time,
am I gonna
attention,
love them
love, right.
equally?
Yeah,
like,
totally.
could I love them? How could I love another person?
Right.
Right.
And then you compound that with
Right.
these things that you're experiencing, and that feeling, I would imagine, is like exponentially worse, right?
Yeah. And it's funny you say that too, because there was even a point, like, I think as we were approaching 33 weeks, and I was like, we're almost to 34, like, we're almost there. They had started to say, like, if you want, you can go past 34 weeks. And I was like, are you for real? Like, no. And then I was feeling so guilty about that. I was like, now you want me to decide to like have her early versus like
Right.
maybe she could make it a few more weeks. And I was
Right.
like, but I can't make it a few more weeks.
Right.
So I was so happy that she made that decision.
Yeah.
Because then I had like that piece that I was like, don't offer more weeks. No.
But also, don't put this shit on me.
Well, it sounds like you had spent the last 4 weeks really crafting plans on that antepartum floor.
Yes. Yeah. So let's. I know that's where you were going. So let's get back to your plan.
Yes. Yeah. So my plan. So yeah, I was like, I'm going to have this great delivery. She's going to be so small. It'll be easy. Then I'm going to go home, be with my toddler, and we'll just go back and forth. And I was like, she's going to do great. Like nothing is going to go wrong. I'm like, this is going to be perfect. So I had her, and the delivery itself was like very easy. It was very quick. One thing that I had been like kind of hung up on was that she was head down, but face up. And I was like, does that worry anyone? And they were like, no, like most babies turn in the birth canal. Like she's little, don't worry about it. And I was like, very like, like this doesn't feel right. And so after we had her, like the NICU team was there, they took her. I was like, told my husband to go with her. She was doing well. And maybe like 20 minutes later, when my labor and delivery nurse was getting me ready to go down to the NICU and then back to antepartum, when they do, what is it? Like when they check your
fundal massage.
Yes, that. So she did that, and I'd been feeling like a little off, and all of a sudden she was checking my uterus, and there was like a massive like gush.
Yeah.
And so that turned into like a pretty significant hemorrhage. They thought at first it was retained products, so they were manually trying to extract. They couldn't find anything. They thought they were like just searching and searching. They like, could not stop the bleeding.
Which
so finally,
searching, by the way, is like hand in the vagina up to your throat.
Yeah, like in your uterus.
It was alarming to see.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was like,
and your husband's not with you at this point in time, or he?
So he came back like in the middle of that. God. And he walked into the room and I was like, look away, like, don't look. And he was like, what is happening?
Yeah. Wow. Okay.
So he came back in the middle of that. And then finally, like, I mean, I don't know how long they actually were trying to like manually find bits of placenta, but they were finally like, all right, like we need to talk about some other options. And I was like, excellent. I would like to go to sleep. They were like, great, let's bring you to the OR.
Okay.
So they brought me to the OR and they ended up finding, I had a cervical tear.
Wow.
Yeah. So they think that was the cause of the hemorrhage and that it potentially could have been from her coming out face up. And her head is enormous, like was enormous, is still really big. That's like the only part of her body that was not like preemie.
They're prepping you for this small baby, but you're like, actually.
Yeah. Her head was so big. So they repaired that. And that was one piece that I just like wasn't prepared for,
especially to go to sleep, right? To go under, conscious sedation. Do they do conscious sedation, like medications in an IV? Yeah. Okay. Wow. Yeah. And then like, now you're coming out of, surgery a little bit, right?
And lose so much blood. Like you just feel, I'm going to imagine you felt like not only super tired, but a little lightheaded, and you just delivered
Yeah,
a
they
baby
did
not-
do, I did have to have 2 blood transfusions that made me feel like so much better.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again,
Okay,
just
so
like
your plan's are already not going according to plan, and we're just at your delivery. Yeah.
You're going to cough that baby out and hop on home to that toddler.
Yeah, it gets better from here, sort of, mostly.
Yeah.
But so like that, I think like the physical recovery, I just
Yeah.
like really wasn't expecting to have that. I think with my first, it was like a super easy delivery. I like didn't have any complications, and I was like, you know, she's so little, it'll be great. And then I had that happen, and I think, you know, finally getting home from the hospital, just not being able to physically interact with my toddler the way that I was expecting to be able to.
Yeah.
Was really hard to not be able to like pick him up and run around and play.
Yeah.
And I, you know, thankfully I think he was so little that he like didn't really understand. But like for me, that was really hard. Just I guess the healing process just I felt like it took so much longer than my first time in such a different way. And I just like really wasn't prepared for that.
In your defense, Sarah, like if this was, I was thinking about, because we talk to a lot of patients like before they deliver, right? Whether you're a first time or a second or third time expecting parent. And so like if, you know, if we had talked while you were on the antepartum floor, like your experience was so rare, right? And so I was thinking about like, had I talked to you, I would have said to you all the same things that you were thinking, like as an experienced labor and delivery nurse, like you had a great delivery with your first, like it was a quick delivery. You felt pretty good afterwards. You didn't have a hemorrhage, right?
This is a small baby.
You're
like healthy.
Yeah. Like, so there is this element of, I want to validate that like that was a really hard experience because it was unfortunately just really hard and rare, right?
Very
and
unexpected.
Like your thoughts going very unexpected, and like your thoughts going into that, I don't think you could have done anything differently as it related to like how you were planning for and what you were thinking about your delivery. I really don't. It was just like a really shitty, unfortunate situation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If nobody else has told you that, let me offer that up to you.
We're here to tell you.
No, thank you. I really appreciate that. I think that's like, you know, and again, it's like another thing that's hard is that, you know, like your relatives and your friends, like I feel like you just like don't get it until either like, you know, you guys do this for a living, like you see this happen or like you've been through it. It's like you just can't like imagine it until it's like happening.
Right. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's hard enough at a baseline coming home. Well, we both have been there coming home to that second child that's still in a diaper, that's a toddler under 2, and at a regular baseline normal vaginal delivery for both of us, and them wanting to like climb on you or you pick them up or you play with them, and like life just carrying on for them in their little toddler mind.
Yeah.
And so at a baseline, that's already really hard in figuring out just how to split your time and how to move postpartum. But then we layer on actually what you went through. And I mean, you can describe it more, but I would imagine you were having some pain in addition to not feeling great from all the blood loss.
Yeah. So and I'm sure you guys know about this far more than I do, but so I ended up so with the cervical tear, they repaired it and I was still bleeding. So they had to do like vaginal packing. And that was like awful. Could not wait for the next day for that to come out.
Yeah.
And once it did, I felt a lot better because, I mean, after you have a vaginal delivery, like it just feels so heavy.
Yes.
And like looking back on it, I really should have seen like a pelvic PT.
Yeah.
I didn't. I think it probably would have been extremely helpful. But yeah, like the pain and discomfort, and just like, I feel like healing just took so long. Like I remember seeing my OB at my 6-week appointment and I was like, am I ever going to feel normal? And she was like, you will, I promise.
Yeah.
And she's right, but
it took a while.
It took a while. Yeah. A lot longer than I thought.
Wow.
So now you're home with like after this really challenging delivery.
And it ended up being at 34 weeks in the end.
33.
33. Got it. Okay.
And so what, like, prior to your delivery, what were you thinking about as it related to your plan for like managing your time between home and the hospital? And how did that plan change based on like what happened with your delivery?
Yeah. So I think like at first, just like the discomfort and the healing, I found it really hard. Like I needed people to drive me into the city. Like it was just too long of a drive. So like, my husband and like, of course he wanted to see our daughter as well. But it was hard. Like our plan was that he would go back to work until she came home.
Right.
Which like totally made sense. I'm
Yeah.
happy we did it that way. But after that, I think like traffic was really the biggest issue that made getting into the city awful, and then having to like leave early enough to pick my son up. I just felt like I had like all of this missed time in the NICU, and that was really hard. And then I also just felt like, my husband and I were not ever really able to go together because one of us was always staying with our son.
Yeah.
And that I just remember wishing like, oh, like I wish we could go together.
Yeah.
Because I found being there, I was so happy to be with her, but I just think like I was always anxious being there, like the beeping of the monitors. I was always afraid of her having a spell. Like I was afraid to move her, and the nurses are like incredible, and they're like, don't worry, it's okay. I'm like, but like she's gonna have a spell.
Right.
But I think the actual NICU part, like I think we made like the best of it. Like we did the best we could. There was one point where they had said, so she was in the NICU for, I want to say like 2 of her 4 weeks. And then they moved her across the hall to special care. And when we did that, they did say, if you want to transfer her. So Beverly is our closest hospital. They were like, you can transfer her there. And I just like felt so strongly that, what, like this pregnancy was not ideal. She's been in the NICU. I just like, I didn't want to move her. And I was like, I would rather just deal with this. I'd rather her be, at BI.
Right. They know her now. They know me.
Like, God forbid something happened. I was like, I don't want to have to be, because, they were like, well, we can always bring her back. And I was like, but like,
no.
I couldn't handle that.
You can always bring it back.
So I was like, I'm going to deal with the traffic. Like, it'll be, totally. It's fine.
It's like the beast that you know or the beast that you don't know. Yes. And at like this stage, I feel like in your pregnancy and your postpartum, it was like, I'm just going to stick with the beast that I know.
Yeah. And Sarah, question for you. Where was your son at this point? Is he in a daycare? Is he in a school? Like with family?
Yeah, so he still goes, he's at a daycare, like a little Montessori school. And like they were amazing. So I was like really thankful that he had that routine. Looking back on it, it's so funny. I'll like ask him sometimes about it, and he like has no memory.
No clue.
And I remember people being like, don't worry, like he's never going to remember. And I just be crying, and I'm like, he's going to remember I was gone.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good reminder, Sarah, just about like the resilience of kids versus adults, right?
Yes.
Like kids are so fucking resilient, and like we can probably take a page out of their book sometimes as adults.
Yes.
Or even if you were gone all day in the NICU and they missed you, if you got home that night and read him 3 books for 10 minutes, all of a sudden he's like, I love you. This is all I really needed right now in this moment. Totally. You're like, okay. Okay. So I was just thinking logistically, so you're like, getting a child out the door to daycare, you have vaginal packing, your husband's driving you to the hospital, he's back at work, but then you have to leave to get home for pickup.
Yeah.
That's like insane.
Yeah, it's a lot of dynamics.
Yeah, a lot of dynamics.
Yeah, it was a lot of moving pieces. I think as like time went on, it felt like more of a routine that like I would, say hi to Charlie in the morning, and then I would leave and my husband would do drop off. And I think in the end, like towards the end of her NICU stay, I was like, all right, I'm all done with this. Like, I don't want to, like, I can't keep sitting in traffic for hours every day. But I was like, it just it is what it is. And the NICU nurses are incredible. I think like one thing that I didn't experience was that as much as I hated leaving her, I felt so good about who I was leaving her with.
Oh, that's so nice, Sarah.
That like, I was sad to not be with her, but I knew that like people were there and like they were snuggling her and There was one of her night nurses would say like, oh, she just loves when I like run her head under the warm water. And she's like, so I wash her hair every night. I'm like, that sounds so nice.
Yeah. Will somebody do that for me?
Yeah.
No, it's
So,
so
like,
true. I
so
think
sweet.
that's so nice of you to say, and I'm so glad that that was your experience, because it is this element of like, you're not just leaving a patient at a hospital to be cared for by a nurse,
Yeah.
right? Like these nurses like really care,
They do.
Yes.
not for, about these babies.
Right.
And you feeling that level of comfort with leaving her, and the nurses being a part of you not having to feel guilty doing that,
Yes.
right? Or as
Yeah.
guilty, probably depending on the day.
Yeah.
I think is huge. So that's so amazing that that was your experience. Do you mind me asking what we just haven't touched on it? What was your plan
Yeah.
for, again, maybe this changed, but what was your plan for feeding her before, or maybe you broke your water, versus how your delivery went, obviously knowing you had a hemorrhage, and after, like, had you been planning on breastfeeding and you weren't able to do that? Did you end up exclusively pumping? Did you just decide to do formula? Just curious sort of what the evolution of that was.
Yes. So yeah, that was one other thing I wanted to talk about too. So I knew that I was going to be pumping at first. Before we knew she was a preemie, I breastfed my first. I was like, I was kind of like, I was hopeful that it was going to be an easier experience the second time. So I was like excited to do it again. But so I knew I was going to be pumping just because she had a feeding tube for a long time. I knew she was going to be on added calories. The NICU was like really great about like preparing you for all of that. And so when we were in the NICU, like the nurses and the lactation consultants in the NICU again were like incredible, and they were so pro, like, you know, if you want to breastfeed, like let's do it. And I felt like we were making some progress, and the plan was when we were discharged that Ella was doing great. She was taking her feeds by bottle, and that I could exclusively breastfeed 1 or 2 times a day. And I was a little bit nervous about that just because I felt like when she was breastfeeding, like it was exhausting for her.
Yeah.
And I was like, is she getting enough food? I don't know, but they say she's doing great. So like, let's see what happens. So we get home from the NICU, and it was like all of a sudden she like was not interested in her bottle. It was really hard to get her to eat. And so the other thing was that the NICU had said, you know, most of the time these babies are on added calories until their due date. And then after that, you know, they're just on, you know, like regular formula or breast milk. And so that was kind of like my expectation, I think, based off of hearing that. And then getting home, and all of a sudden, you know, she like doesn't want to finish a bottle. Like I just remember like a 90 milliliter bottle is like 3 ounces. It took us months to get her to eat 3 ounces.
Yeah.
Wow.
And talking with my pediatrician, that was like what he typically saw happen with these preemies. And he was like, you know, like, I don't think she should be having any feeds without the added calories. And B, like, he was like, you know, I typically see like, you know, 90% of preemies like stay on added calories until they're like 6 months. So at that point,
Different
I was kind of,
expectations then.
yeah,
than what
very
you were prepped
different.
for.
And so at that point, I kind of was like, oh, like 6 months. Like I was hoping that my plan had been, we'll get home, she'll come off of added calories, you know, hopefully she'll be breastfeeding. And if that's really hard, like have you guys come out, because we did that with my son, and just like make a plan to like have breastfeeding happen. Cause I was like, I'm not going to pump forever. Like I hate pumping.
Yep.
Preach.
And that did not happen. She ended up having like a lot, again, like took her months to drink a 3-ounce bottle. She was on added calories until she was 6 months. And there were times where we ended up having to go up on her added calories than what she came home on because she wasn't gaining weight.
Yep.
So like that was like another experience that I just really wasn't prepared for.
Right.
And
It's
so,
such a different experience than what you were planning for, expecting, but even just from your first
right.
experience.
Yeah. Like, as you said, like, you know, babies go home on added calories and are usually on added calories until their due date. I think and and I'm thinking about this more like with our time in the hospital, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think like, I'm thinking about this as a medical professional, right? And like what we say to patients.
Yeah.
And it's like, right? Like my understanding as a medical professional is people like you, like just want like answers. And it's really frustrating to not get like really clear answers, right? So then you end up saying things like, your baby's usually in the NICU until your due date, right?
Right.
Your baby will do this until their due date or until 3 months or until 6 months.
Right.
And it's like, and there's an element where like, maybe sometimes that's true, right? Like, so I think it's this combination of like, sometimes this is true and we do have like some, I don't want to say evidence, anecdotal scenarios to support that. And like, I'm just trying to give you like a answer in a scenario where you feel like you're like probably not getting any. And I don't
just give me something. Here.
Right. And I don't necessarily know that we're doing anybody, like, I think we're doing people a disservice by sometimes not just being like, look, it could be 3 months. It could be 6 months.
For a couple, I remember specifically when we worked at the hospital, a couple NPs from the NICU, and they really would say to parents, it's just going to be up to the baby.
Yeah, it's a range.
They would give the ranges and the numbers, but they always drove home like, it's up to them, which then you're back in this area of like, okay,
cool. What does that mean?
But how often or what do you think?
So I'm saying that, we're obviously saying that from the view as the medical providers, but Sarah, I'm curious, like, maybe this is something you thought about at the time. Maybe this is something that you're thinking about now looking back on it. Would it have really mattered if like the verbiage had changed for you in that time? Like, would it actually have been more helpful to have like more of a range than like a set, date? Yeah, I guess maybe as somebody who's gone through this, what do you actually think would have been helpful as it related to how people answered these questions that maybe were like, there was a wide range of how this could go?
Yeah, I think definitely a range. Like, and again, like I had no like hard feelings about like
reference
they said,
point. Right.
Yeah, like they said this date, like it wasn't like I never felt like upset about that. I think it made me curious. Is there data and like how these preemies do? I'm like such a data-driven person.
Yeah.
That I was like, I wonder, and I like haven't looked, but I do wonder, like, is there data on how long like premature babies are on added calories for?
Yeah. Right.
So it just more made me interested, but I do think a range would probably be more helpful. I think the one thing that I felt like they were great about was that, everyone's like, when is my baby going to go home? And they were like, plan on at least like your due date or beyond. So they're like very good at setting that expectation.
Okay. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah. At some point though, feeding does become slightly out of the realm of certain providers in the hospital.
Yes.
True. Yeah. And especially when these aren't.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say, and sometimes, especially when you're not the provider taking care of the baby at home, right?
Exactly.
You get discharged home. Care is transferred to your pediatrician. Your pediatrician is going to handle care from this point out. Maybe does have a different way that they would approach a scenario like this that was different than maybe the care you're receiving in the hospital. So there's a lot of variables that you're dealing with as soon as you're discharged home too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. And I was really, really thankful that our pediatrician had said most of the premature babies that I take care of are on added calories for 6 months. So that definitely gave me and I remember asking him like, is there a chance she could be on it longer? And he was like, really, like probably not.
Okay.
So that
you felt like your expectations were reset at that point.
Yeah.
I
think so.
Yeah. Was there something else you wanted to add, Sarah, before I ask you another question?
No.
Okay.
I don't think so.
So I feel like you've talked about like a few elements here, right? Like the element of being away from your toddler, right? When you were in-house, when you were admitted, of, that feeling of guilt of splitting up your time. Even in you talking about like having this desire for you and your husband to be able to go to the NICU together also.
Yeah.
I'm curious as it relates to support systems that you had in place, in particular, family members and friends. How did you utilize that support? And is there anything that you would have done differently with those people? Is there anything that you would have done differently with those people, or advice that you would give somebody going through a similar scenario of how to best utilize those people?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think when I was admitted, my husband is very much the type of person that's like, I got this. I don't need help. And I was like, you definitely need help. He was still working and Charlie, obviously like wasn't gone all day
Right.
and night. So like that was stressful. So I think, I had his parents are farther away. So it was a lot harder for my in-laws to come help. But my mom was up all the time, like picking Charlie up from school,
Okay.
making sure that they had like dinner,
Yep.
Yeah.
bringing him in to see me. So I think just like telling people exactly what you need, like I need you to help with school pickup, or I need you to help with like dinner.
Mm-hmm.
I think food was like a really big thing, especially when we were in the NICU. Like that was
Mm-hmm.
really hard. It was just like, oh, like, we've all been all over the place and like now we have to like figure out what to eat and like feed our kid.
Yeah.
So I think like putting those things in place would have been really helpful. And having those types of things lined up, both like while you're in the hospital and then like once you're home.
Yeah.
I have two quick thoughts. Sorry. One is I think it's interesting that you said that your husband is the one who was like, I can do this all. Because
Yeah.
I feel like we often are working with women, largely we work with dads, right? And partners. But a lot of times it's often moms that we're working that are like gatekeeping or like, I'll just figure this out. I'll handle it. But I think it's interesting to like mention that this could actually be your partner who is like trying to take it all on.
Be a
And
martyr.
you're being like, hold on a second. I actually don't even want that for you.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. So I even remember like when my water broke and I was admitted, he was like, he didn't want to like tell anyone. And he was like, well, he's like, what am I going to do? Like text my friends and be like, hey, guess what? Like Sarah's water broke.
FYI.
And I was like, well, like,
Yeah.
yeah, your friends should know.
Yeah. Like this is a big thing.
Right. And I
Right.
just remember like once like we kind of like told everyone, and it definitely was a weird thing to like, I told my best friends, but like to tell like friends that like,
Right.
oh, hey, like I can't come to that. Like I'm in the hospital for until who knows how long.
Turns out I'm tied up.
But just like knowing that like there were so many people that like wanted to support my
Yeah.
husband.
Right.
And that it was really hard for him too to be
Let them in.
like solo parenting at home. Yeah. And like accepting the help.
Yeah.
Yeah. My second part of that too is that I heard you say, Sarah, that it's important to have help lined up when you're in the NICU and going in and out and when you're all home again.
Yeah.
Do you feel like looking back though, I guess I feel like sometimes I work with families who are saving the help or like, we're not going to pull in all those favors until we're home.
Mm.
Did you do that? Or do you feel like you were like, no, we need, like, I know you can see it now, right? But
yeah.
you
Spread it
need
out.
help even when the baby's in the NICU because you're still
Right.
driving around and doing all the things. Yeah. Do you feel like you evenly spread it out basically?
I don't. I feel like I used all of my help like while we were in the NICU. And then when we got home, I mean, I think the transition from 1 to 2 was like wild. I think it's wild. Regardless. But I was kind of like, oh my God, like I need like probably like 2 other adults here. Like I can't watch both kids.
Totally. Right.
So I definitely didn't evenly split it. And I probably would if I had to if I could redo it.
Right. When you were thinking about, I think one question is, and this has come up when I've asked people how you can support a family who has a baby in the NICU or when they transition home, is rides. That was a big one that a lot of people said when I've asked this question before. So I think rides is a big one. But again, coming back to this point of like you wishing that like you and your husband could have gone together, like even maybe just planning for that, right? Like one day a week, you have somebody watching your older kid, right? Watching your son so that you both can visit the hospital together. Like, again, I'm thinking about this more of like, what are things that we can tell people who maybe end up in this situation before? Like, maybe that's something to consider too. And then the other question that I was going to ask you is we've talked a lot about like how people helped you with like the physical things, the logistics, right? Around like daycare drop off and pickup, meals, like maybe even coming into your house and, folding laundry or stocking the fridge or whatever.
Making sure your toddler's backpack is ready for the morning.
Right. What about the emotional support? Like how, if any, what did you find most helpful in terms of the emotional support from family members or friends for you, like while you were on the antepartum unit, while, you know, you had a baby in the NICU, once you came home from the hospital, is there anything significant that you remember about that? Either somebody did something like really great and or like you actually wish that maybe you had somebody who was more regularly checking up on you there.
Yeah. So I think I'm losing my train of thought. Yeah. I think emotional, like in terms of like the emotional aspect of coming home, I found it really helpful. One of my best friends has 2 kids and both of our kids are like very close in age, like a couple weeks apart. And having her to talk to about, I found the transition going from 1 to 2, like really a lot.
Yeah.
And I felt really thankful to have her of like, oh, like, how do you do it? Like, what do we do? How do we get through this? So I'm so glad that I had her. And I think, you know, like my mom was so supportive throughout all of that. And we have some really close friends that were always checking in. And I think just like, even from like, you know, on antepartum, I like visitors, like go see whoever is there as often
Love
as you
that.
can.
Yep.
One of my good friends works at Children's, and so she would come see me like multiple times a week.
That's nice.
And I just like would cry every time I would see her because I was just so thankful that she like came to see me. And I think too, like being on antepartum, like bringing someone food, like the hospital food was awful. I'm like so thankful to have family and friends that like I don't think I ever ate. I think I maybe ate 1 hospital meal my 4 weeks that I was there. So I was so lucky about that. Like, and I think my mom came in, I think almost every single day.
It sounds like you have
Which
a wonderful mom.
She is a really good mom. Yeah, and I think I found the NICU a little bit trickier. I think when we were there, COVID precautions were still going on. It was like right after she got discharged that like everything opened back up. But I think that one was a little trickier. I think family and friends didn't really know how to navigate that of like, is the baby okay? Like what's okay to ask and what's not. So I think for that, like just checking in or saying like, send me a picture, like always made me feel so good. Just hearing from people being like, you know, how's Ella doing?
Yeah.
I think like just not being afraid to ask. Yeah. And then I think again, like once you get home, I think at least in my experience, it kind of felt like everyone was like, ooh, all right, they're home. Everything's good. But like, we still were going from then had that transition of like having them both home and navigating that.
Yeah.
Plus feeding struggles, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah. The feeding struggles. And I think that was another thing that like was hard I have one friend who had a baby who was born early and had like sort of like a similar feeding issue, but like having friends who didn't get like the stress of like my baby won't eat and she won't eat the added calories, like and she's not gaining weight. Like how do I get this baby to eat? But yeah, and I think my husband was amazing. I think he really was like, I mean, he was so supportive throughout everything and like still is, like we still talk about it. And I think just like recognizing that like it was really challenging for him too. And it's always interesting to hear like his perspective on it all because
It's a
I
totally
think
different perspective.
For sure.
Yeah.
Right.
I think I like not forget, but like a lot of things that like didn't bother me were like really hard for him. But yeah, I think checking in, I think is like the biggest thing that was the most helpful during that whole period of time.
Yeah. It sounds like even though you couldn't find some of these resources that you were looking for like online, right?
Yeah.
Or like more formal places to go for the support, that you did end up, I mean, this ended up working out for you, right? Because you had some people that you could rely on with the friend who had 2 kids, with the friend who, you know, the one friend who had a baby a little bit early, that you did have that peer support. And the peer support is so important. Were there any resources that the hospital gave you, like a social worker or anybody related to? Yeah, groups or
Yeah,
parents that you
so
could talk to?
there was, yes, they did connect me with a social worker when I was admitted. And she actually, this was like one thing that I found amazing. So she took me to do a tour of the NICU, and she actually asked another mom if she could bring me in to meet her. And she had had her water break, I think around the same time. Her baby ended up coming, I think at like 29 weeks. So like,
Wow.
again,
Yeah.
a very different stay, but just like meeting someone else and her just being so willing to share her experience and
That's
like
nice.
what she went through was just so helpful to hear. Again, like the COVID thing made it really tricky. The antepartum unit was doing like weekly group like meetings. I just like, I never wanted to do it. I remember I was so scared that something was going to happen to her. And I just was like, I can't, like, I don't want to hear other stories that are going to make me more nervous.
For sure.
So I didn't do that.
Yeah.
But the nurses did tell me that, like, again, like pre-COVID, they would do like different like arts and crafts and like things. And like that would have been really nice. Like, I think I would have really liked that.
Yeah.
But then in the NICU, again, I think it was just like the COVID precautions. Like there was no like parent
interacting
support
with
groups.
other parents who
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I imagine too that like you feel similarly as a NICU parent. Like I'm so thankful. Like we had a very healthy baby. Like she just needed to learn how to eat and grow.
Yep.
And I can imagine like being a NICU parent of a baby that has a lot of like medical needs. That wouldn't be like it would be really hard to hear like, oh, like my baby's just, you know, feeding and growing. So
Yep.
I'm sure that's tricky. I don't know. Yeah, I think I did find like a couple of things on Instagram of like people talking about like NICU experiences. And like that was really helpful. But I just think like the more other people can like share their experience. And I know you guys did recently, you asked like what was helpful.
Yeah.
And I just think like that's amazing for like friends and family and like podcasts. When I was in the hospital, I know you guys have like a handful, like you had like a NICU doctor, I think. Like I was listening.
NICU moms, we've had a few NICU experts.
Yeah, like just listening to everything because I was like, I just need to hear like how other people felt and like what it was like for them. So like I think things like this are so helpful. My one like regret coming home was not doing a veteran mom MSG. I'm like kicking myself for not having done it because I was like, holy shit, like 2 kids is wild.
Yeah, it's a tough transition.
Jamie runs a lot of those, and mostly the moms just talk about the first kid.
Oh yeah, the hardest part about having your second is your first. I mean, maybe that wasn't your experience.
No,
but
it
once
was
you're home, it is,
I remember
right?
I remember listening to you say that on something, and I was like, that's like the truest thing I have ever heard. Like, despite all of the like, you know, the feeding issues and all of that with Ella afterwards, like she was easy.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, the toddler was wild.
Yeah. I mean, I know we're a little late on telling you this, but also appreciate that you're coming onto the podcast and doing this so that other people in a similar situation can hear your story and hopefully feel some relief and resonate. But even there's a lot of times where patients will reach out to us. I literally just talked to a patient yesterday where they have what feels like a unique scenario, and some of them really are unique scenarios, but have a scenario where they're like having a really hard time finding resources or somebody who's been through it. And so, I mean, we've been in business now since 2011, right? We've taken care of a lot of patients. We've run a lot of groups. We usually have somebody who's had similar experience, or at least something that's relatable about the experience, whether it is a NICU stay or premature ruptured membranes, or feeding struggles or multiples, or babies who have had, we've even had babies who have had like major surgeries right after delivery, right? So even like we're even able to connect people too. And even you coming on and sharing your story, Sarah, I know, right? Like if somebody came to us and said, hey, like, do you know anybody who broke the water at 29 weeks and knew they had a NICU stay ahead of them? Like, you are a resource for somebody like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But even just knowing that, like, if you just reach out to us with something, like, I will come hell or high water, I will find somebody who you can chat with. Hopefully, again, the reason why we're formatting the podcast this way and having people share these stories is so that we can bring light to these situations, make you feel less known, and connect people if they want to connect, right? So I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you coming on today, Sarah, and sharing.
Thank you, Sarah.
My gosh.
So lovely.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I think I am so thankful that you guys are doing this. I think that this is just like the most incredible resource for moms and partners. And it's just so needed. And everything you guys do is just incredible.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I don't know if your husband would ever do this, but maybe we can have him on and he can share his perspective of all of this.
That'd be great.
Oh my gosh, I would love that.
Sign him up.
He's in.
I love it. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. We really appreciate it.
And all of our listeners will be back again next week with another postpartum story.
Yeah. Hang on one sec, Sarah. Let me just hit, I'm just going to hit stop and then it's just going to upload.